The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
And in Washington, the draft is invoked, calling out millions of men. Here is the lottery of a draft. President Wilson draws the first number. Vice President Marshall draws the second. There are 5 million names before it is finished. And from the Atlantic seaboard, America's second wave starts for Europe.
After the United States joined World War I in 1917, nearly 1,600 soldiers from Florida were killed in battle. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. Florida was still a relatively small state in the early 20th century, but it was significantly impacted by World War I.
Well, remember, Florida's a very small state, and it's an agricultural state. It has about 750,000 people, which isn't very large. You know, you have a Pennsylvania, which has millions, in New York. So it's not going to play as large a role from the point of either industry or men who enlist. I mean, it's actually fairly interesting in that there are people who enlist and there's also a draft. And the draft wasn't really because people wouldn't go, but we're going to have to go from an army of 150,000 and eventually to one of 4 million. And they really need to take people in batches. So Florida will provide about the same percentage of other states. 43,000 Floridians will serve. 13,000 of those are African Americans.
In addition to providing troops and agricultural products for the war effort, Florida's climate and access to water provided an excellent environment for year-round military training.
So you had Naval Air Station Pensacola, which was going to train Navy pilots. But once the war came, a lot of other facilities opened up. In Miami, Curtiss, who was a very well-known aircraft manufacturer, had a training facility. And it had trained civilian pilots. When the war came, the government contracted it, and it trained all the services, Army, Navy, and Marines. And the Marine part of the story is very important. The Army built in DeSoto County, Carlstrom and Dorfield, to train its pilots. So when the war came, people started thinking about planes in other ways. Well, first, of course, you have to train your basic pilot, which is hard in those days because there aren't a lot of people who are pilots to train other people to be pilots. So they had all of these different training facilities, probably because the weather was good all the time, and there was a lot of water around, but that's a very important role. But another thing that will happen is they start thinking in terms of bombing and using aircraft for that. So Miami trained a Marine unit in bombing tactics that actually went overseas and was among the first aircraft that bombed the enemy. So if you see all of the aircraft installations in Florida, in many ways, particularly for the Marines, this is the birthplace of modern aviation, military and naval aviation. And it also had a very large base in Jacksonville, Camp Joe E. Johnston, which became the primary quartermaster training facility.
Private Marion Joseph Lasco was the only soldier from Jacksonville's Mandarin community to be killed in battle during World War I. An exhibit at the Mandarin Museum and Historical Society honors Lasco.
We know of a local man that we do feature in an exhibit here who was a farmer. And his family had a grape orchard here and made wine and sold vegetables, and he was really, really important to the family business. He was the oldest son, and he was drafted and sent to France and died in France. So I would think that that was probably the story of most of the men in Florida who went. They probably were doing work that their families depended on them for. And my guess is they didn't have any idea why they were going. World War I especially was so confusing and complicated and why it started. And my guess is that when this man went, and probably most of them, they really didn't know what it was all about, but they went because they were drafted and it was their duty to go.
World War I began when Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was murdered. The Austrians declared war against Serbia, putting the alliance of Russia, France, and Great Britain to war against the alliance of Germany and Austria-Hungary. In 1917, America joined the conflict against the Germans and sent Florida's Marion Joseph Lasco to France, where he fought and died. Lasco's family winery is preserved in the Walter Jones Historical Park, adjacent to the Mandarin Museum.
His mother and his father both emigrated here from Italy, and his mother's family, there's still a winery in Italy with her name, her family name. But they had a small winery in Mandarin, about 3 miles from here, but they also had a big farm, a vegetable farm, and there were many children, and they lived in a farmhouse, you know, and they were a big part of the community that we call Loretto. It was the Loretto part of what is now Mandarin. A lot of Catholic families there. They were very, very religious family. Helped start St. Joseph's Catholic Church, which is in the Loretto area. And so they were very prominent in that part of the community. They were very active in that part of the community. You know, they were very well known, and there's a road named after them, Lasco Road, here in the Loretto area of Mandarin.
They had initially 160 acres. 7 acres of that was devoted to raising Scuppernong grapes, from which they made approximately 40 barrels of wine per year. The rest of the property, and as far as farming goes, was basically truck farming, vegetable farming, and so on, which you would then sell in season to local restaurants, hotels, schools, this type of thing. The winery was just one aspect of the total farm operation. And as far as we know, that's basically what he did as a young man. We have no idea how far he went in school, formal schooling. An aunt of mine who has since passed away said that at the time he enlisted, that he was driving a hack in Jacksonville, which we're not sure if that was a horse and buggy or if it was actually a vehicle. But so far we have found no records showing that he was a licensed hack driver or so on. He made no mention of that in his letters, and we have found no. So as far as you know, on his sign-up papers, he was listed as a farmer.
We were very fortunate to be given by one of the Lasco family members, the man who lived in the farmstead the last, and then it was sold and it's now become a subdivision. And he found in the attic a box of letters that Marion Lasco had written to his mother and his sister, mostly to his family members, and his mother had kept all the letters. After he was killed, she of course kept the telegram that said he was missing in action, the telegram that said he was dead, the information from the Army that said, would you like to come to his grave, or do you want him to come home, or do you want him to stay in France? So all of this correspondence and communication was in this box, as well as the things that the Army sent back from France after he died. He was only there 2 months, and he died before the war ended. And in that box were a lot of religious medals. He had quite a few St. Christopher medals and rosary beads and things like that. There was also a half-smoked cigar. So in his letters, he talked about how he missed a good cigar, but when he got one, he would smoke it and keep it and then come back to it. But he didn't get back to finish the cigar. And we have that on display, as well as all these things that were sent to his family and copies of the letter and the telegrams and so forth. And it was just amazing. I mean, this man walked in here one day with this box and said, "This is a story that's very important to my family. I am afraid, when I die, it may not be passed on. What do you think about this?" And immediately I had goosebumps. I was about to cry when I looked at those letters.
Private Lasco's letters have been compiled into a book called A Soldier's Story. The book was edited by Lasco's great-nephew, Paul Giotto, a third-generation Jacksonville native retired from the National Park Service and the Naval Reserve. When Giotto agreed to transcribe the letters, he didn't realize that the soldier who wrote them was a relative.
Sandy Arpin, the executive director of the Mandarin Museum and Historical Society, we became acquainted when I was director at the then Jacksonville Maritime Heritage Center downtown. And as we were folding that museum up, we were making available to other museums like the Mandarin one, artifacts that we had in the museum. And she came down and selected several, and we began talking, and she knew of my background with the Park Service and history. And she told me that she had a project that if I was interested in, it would be a great help. Basically transcribing letters from a World War I soldier to his family back home. And she wanted that transcription then placed in some kind of exhibit with the World War I exhibit Centennial coming up. And when I came out here and met with her and we looked in the archives section in the back, first thing I said was, well, these are letters from my great uncle, my dad's namesake from World War I. And she was floored and I was kind of floored because all we knew about him was just a tad. We knew he was buried in France. We had the one photograph taken of him in uniform, but really his story was basically untold.
To tell his great-uncle's story, Giotto had to rely on letters and official documents, as details of Private Lasco's life weren't remembered by any living relatives.
Well, by the time we started looking into his life, all of his siblings, and there were 11 of them who went to age, 2 died young, all of his siblings had died quite a few years before. And so nobody in the family was still alive who remembered Marion growing up, going into the Army, etc. And so that was kind of tough. And so we began to check local church records, the Catholic church down the street at St. Joe's. And we found baptismal records, confirmation records. And then, of course, through Ancestry.com and things like that, Sandy's husband, Tracy, found draft registration papers. Going through the newspapers, we found mention of his death, for instance. We found copies of ships' manifests going to Europe, going by train from here to Camp Jackson, a manifest. And so little by little began putting together his life because there was nobody alive to tell us anything about him.
While the letters of Private Lasco do provide some insight into his wartime experiences, Giotto says there are still some tantalizing mysteries.
Well, first of all, having transcribed letters from people like Andrew Jackson, I was afraid that it might be difficult. But his handwriting was very clear, very clean, a few misspellings. We kept everything basically as he wrote it, grammar and composition style purposes. But about the time I'd get into a letter of his and was looking for some real meat, he would end by saying, well, I guess I have to close for now, write soon, please send me a letter. But we were able to glean quite a bit of camp life at Camp Jackson and then later at Camp Mills on Long Island. When he got to Europe, where we really were hoping to get some meat, he would say basically the same thing, but with a caveat saying, I can't say anything right now because his letters were reviewed by a censor in his unit, usually a second lieutenant. And he did make one statement saying, when I get home, I can tell you all about it. and of course he never made it home.
In addition to the letters, documents, and artifacts from Private Lasco, the World War I exhibit at the Mandarin Museum includes an authentic uniform and other items inspired by his correspondence.
We wanted to make sure that we could outfit the mannequin as close as possible to an average recruit. And since he mentioned that in one letter that on guard duty he had to carry a big tall gun that must weigh at least 10 pounds with a long knife on the end, a bayonet. So he wanted to make sure he had a long gun with a knife such as he had. And basically the soldier here, the particular uniform you see on display actually belonged to a real soldier. And the fellow who owns it bought it really at a flea market in total. So he has various markings and uniforms items on him that a basic recruit would not have, that you don't see in his boot camp portrait that was taken of him. But that's as close as we can get to bringing Marion Lasco and the others from Mandarin back to life.
The Lasco family winery is preserved on the property of the Mandarin Museum and Historical Society in Jacksonville. In some of his letters, Lasco said he missed drinking his family's wine.
Yes, he did. At one point he said, all we have here in camp is soda and beer. And he really missed his dad's cold wine. And when he went to France, he did say that the best wine he tasted was the champagne, but it was very expensive. All the other wine he tasted he considered somewhat inferior to what he grew on the land here in Duval County.
In Hillsborough County, fallen soldiers from World War I are remembered with a mural and exhibit at the Tampa Bay History Center commemorating the USS Tampa. The United States Coast Guard cutter Tampa was sunk in September of 1918 while on convoy duty off the coast of England. All on board were killed, including many Floridians.
It was assigned and ported in Tampa, and also it visited the Gasparilla Festival, and it was very tied to the city of Tampa. When the war came, like all Coast Guard ships, it became mobilized, and it actually became part of the Navy as an anti-submarine vessel. And it did very well. It did very well until a submarine sank it. And there were a lot of Floridians aboard. There were a lot of young Floridians aboard. There was one set of brothers, the Belvins, who died together. There were lots of sets of brothers on the ship. And this was actually one of the largest losses of lives for Florida, but actually the largest for the Coast Guard during the war.
In 1924, a scroll was buried in Jacksonville's Memorial Park that attempted to list the names of all of the Florida soldiers killed in World War I. Recently, historian R.B. Rosenberg has discovered that nearly 400 names were left off of that list. In 2018, Hurricane Irma flooded Memorial Park, and it was feared that the buried scroll may have been damaged.
The association decided that we're really, out of abundance of caution, that maybe we ought to check on the scroll. Apparently there's no backup for the scroll. The names for almost 100 years now have not been revealed. And that's why I was contacted over a year ago to try to come up with a list of names. But I believe that had Irma not occurred, then there'd probably not been an urgency to recover it.
When the scroll was unearthed and retrieved from the protective boxes it had been buried in, it was clear that water damage had occurred. Restoration experts from the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program in St. Augustine were able to save and preserve the scroll. Dr. Rosenberg is in the process of collecting details about Florida's World War I casualties, building on the list of names.
In researching the men and their names, I've tried to provide, in addition, and this is a database that I've created and which will be up on the website for the Memorial Park, to provide additional information. I've also, where possible, provided photos of these men. There's also pictures of, if possible, their graves where they're buried either here or over there.
Historians and students from the University of Central Florida have traveled to France to work in the cemeteries of American soldiers.
World War I is so present everywhere in France that I was shocked to find that most Americans didn't know about it or didn't realize that, some Americans died on those battlefields.
The Veterans Legacy Program is a partnership between the National Cemetery Administration and universities to preserve the stories of American servicemen and women. The program results in innovative research, lesson plans for students of all ages, and a variety of digital resources.
The National Cemetery Administration, which is one of the 3 parts of the VA, of the Department of Veterans Affairs, approached us, actually. And I take great pride in that because I think the reason that when the National Cemetery Administration launched the Veterans Legacy Program, their staff was looking for schools that could do a project like this. And we had a number of things that demonstrated that we had the capacity and that we were doing innovative work and we were doing digital humanities already. We had the Veterans History Project, which is a partnership with the Library of Congress, and we've done well over 600 interviews with veterans under the leadership of my colleague, Barbara Gannon. I am proud to say that I was on the ground floor of that project as well, and the students who are in my classes now that are doing Veterans Legacy Program, we're doing that in 2009, 2010. I'm always looking for something innovative in my classes to help students learn in new ways.
So while we were over in France, I had the opportunity to go to Bellawood, the Eyes-Marne Cemetery, Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, and Dr. Lyons and I and some of the other team members would have talks. I decided that this was something that matters. The fall of Rome matters in an extent from a historical perspective, but it's so far away that this is more memories. But I recognize a similarity as well, that I was talking about something that's remembered wrong. How Germans invaded Rome isn't how it happened, and we've continued that myth. Well, another myth is that America, the United States, didn't do much in World War I. And that similar, fact-finding mission and trying to set the record straight kind of hit off some interest, but because of it being closer to, modern contemporary times, this is something we can reach out and touch. And there's far more records, newspaper, as we're doing, we have, biographies of quite a number of veterans. This is something that still matters to people, still matters to families. You can't trace your family to ancient Rome, but almost everybody had a grandfather or great-grandfather that had, in some way or another, had service in World War I, and grandmothers as well.
One of the things that struck me, in addition to seeing these cemeteries and being at these battlefields, is, and this I expected to feel that. What I didn't expect was how well not only World War I is remembered by the French, but how well the American involvement in that war is remembered by the French. And then comparing that to how America remembers it. From the United States perspective, World War I is a footnote or a prelude to the sequel, which is World War II. That's not the case in France. You went to a new town, new village in France because you saw another World War I monument. That they're marked all around there. Every village has one. I mean, we saw posters that advertised temporary exhibits that showed, that focused solely on the American involvement in the war. And it's really humbling to see something like that in a museum that's dealing with one of the most murderous battles of French history, and certainly in modern French history.
One of the beauties of this program is that whether it's an undergrad or a graduate student, they're really trying to get you to that next step, to where it's not just sitting in the classroom anymore, it's actually reaching out and touching that history.
You can experience a piece of World War I history and exhibits focusing on all of the other wars that America has participated in here at the Veterans Memorial Museum in Merritt Island. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brookmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
And by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org.